In the humid heat of southeastern Texas, between the sprawling expanse of Houston and the Gulf Coast city of Galveston, there lies a stretch of land that would become infamous in American crime history. To most people driving Interstate 45, it looked like any other roadside marsh, overgrown in places with tall grasses, oil fields blurring behind them, and the low murmur of traffic stretching into the horizon. But in the decades beginning in the early 1970s and lasting into the 1990s, this patch of ground became a bleak burial ground for the lost, the missing, and the murdered, so many that the region came to be known as the Texas Killing Fields. It began quietly. The first known disappearance that would later be connected with the region was that of Colette Wilson, a 13-year-old girl who vanished in June 1971. She was dropped off at a bus stop and never made it home. Her body was later found near the Addicks Reservoir, close to the I-45 corridor, not yet fully labeled as a killing field, but an early indication that something sinister was unfolding. Soon after, Gloria Gonzalez, 19, and others such as Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw, both in their early teens, also disappeared and were found dead near the same general area. The bodies were discovered in marshlands, pasturelands, or near the shallow bayous that crisscrossed the land south of Houston. Their disappearances and deaths in the early 1970s would become part of the dark tapestry of the killing fields, a tapestry that future generations would struggle to fully unravel. By the mid-1980s, the land itself had become a graveyard for young victims. The stretch of farmland and oil patches near Calder Road, not far from League City, saw one discovery after another. In 1983, a dog digging in a field brought something unusual back to its owner, what appeared to be a human skull. Authorities were alerted, and what had at first seemed like an isolated tragedy revealed itself to be something far more troubling. The remains belonged to Hyde Valerial Fye, a 25-year-old cocktail waitress who had disappeared after leaving her parents' home to visit her boyfriend. The discovery sent shockwaves through the local community. It was one thing to presume that a missing person might never be found, but quite another to find them discarded like refuse in a field, their body long since claimed by the humid Gulf Coast climate. No one knew then that more victims would follow. In 1984, 16-year-old Laura Miller vanished after leaving her family home to use a payphone at a nearby convenience store, never to return. Her skeletal remains, discovered later in the same field where hides had been found, erased any lingering hope that these were isolated tragedies. They were murders, and they were happening with grotesque regularity. Police investigation tried to make sense of the connections. 4 bodies were uncovered on that initial 25-acre patch along Calder Road between 1983 and 1991. Fye, Miller, and 2 others who for decades remained unidentified. These unidentified victims were known only as Jane Doe and Janet Doe until breakthroughs in DNA and genetic genealogy technology finally gave them names decades later: Audrey Lee Cook, 30, and Donna Prudhomme, 34. Only after scientists extracted DNA from their bones and traced familial connections through genealogy databases were their families finally able to learn what happened to their loved ones nearly 30 years after their deaths. But the killing fields extended far beyond that 25-acre oil field. Over the next 3 decades, as many as 30 women and girls would be found dead along the stretch of land that flanks Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston. Among them were young victims such as Michelle Garvey, only 14 when she disappeared in 1982, and Brooks Bracewell, just 12, when she went missing in 1974. Each disappearance was a nightmare for families, a story cut abruptly from promise to unanswered horror. The pattern was chilling. Young women vanished after ordinary moments: a ride to a friend's house, a stop at a gas station, walking to a phone booth, and were never seen again. Some were presumed runaways initially. In the early years, police often categorized missing person reports in such a way that cases did not receive the urgency they deserved. As bodies turned up in marshes, pastures, and drainage ditches along the I-45 corridor, it became clear that something more sinister was unfolding. Perhaps not a single killer, but a network of killers exploiting the anonymity of the land and the vulnerabilities of their victims. One of the earliest detectives on the case recalled the difficulty of investigating such crimes when all that remained were bones picked over by scavengers and weather. With no witnesses and often no forensic evidence save for skeletal remains, linking victims to suspects became nearly impossible. In the 1980s, the science of forensics was far less advanced than it would become. What might have been clear DNA evidence in later years was then lost to time, decomposition, and environmental erosion. The Washington Post. Despite the lack of definitive forensic leads, law enforcement did build suspects over the years. One of the most talked about figures was Clyde Hendrick, a man with a violent past who had been convicted of abuse of a corpse related to another victim, Ellen Beason, in 1984. Hendrick drew suspicion for years because of his proximity to the fields and the nature of his past offenses, but investigators never managed to secure enough hard evidence to charge him with the Calder Road murders or the other killings associated with the killing fields. Another person who drew intense scrutiny was Robert Abel, a retired NASA engineer who owned property adjacent to the Calder Road area. Abel had been married and divorced multiple times, with at least one ex-spouse reporting threatening behavior. His horseback riding business sat right next to the fields where victims were found, and his presence in the community at the time put him under suspicion. Federal investigators even searched his property in the early 1990s under a warrant, but found no physical evidence tying him to the murders. Abel later died in an apparent suicide in 2005, having maintained his innocence until the end. In the mid-1990s, the focus shifted slightly with the arrest of William Reece, a man eventually connected to several murders in the region. Reece, initially picked up for an unrelated kidnapping, led authorities to the remains of 3 victims when he agreed to cooperate to avoid the death penalty. Among those he led police to were Laura Smither, just 12 years old, Kellyanne Cox, 20, and Jessica Kane, 17, all found buried near or around the fields. Reece ultimately pleaded guilty to these murders and received life sentences in Texas, though he remained incarcerated in Oklahoma on a death sentence for a separate crime. Yet Reece explained only a portion of the deaths connected to the killing fields. Many others remained unsolved. Families like that of Laura Miller grew frustrated with what they saw as mistakes, missed opportunities, and investigations that failed to fully leverage available evidence. Laura's father, Tim Miller, became especially vocal, criticizing law enforcement's early reluctance to search the fields where his daughter's remains were eventually found. His anguish resonated across many families who had lost daughters, sisters, nieces, and friends. Miller's grief eventually propelled him into founding Texas EquuSearch, an organization dedicated to locating missing persons and providing support to families caught in the nightmare of unanswered disappearances. The group would go on to search for hundreds of missing people, alive and dead, across the country, a legacy born from personal tragedy that helped others find closure or answers they never thought possible. In the larger cultural context, the killing fields became more than a series of unsolved murders. It became a symbol of systemic failure and unresolved pain. Documentaries and dramatizations, including the Netflix series Crime Scene, The Texas Killing Fields, narrated the stories of victims, families, and investigators, bringing national attention to a case that had simmered in local consciousness for decades. The series revisited the known facts, explored suspects, and highlighted the advances in forensic technology that finally identified victims long labeled as Jane Doe and Janet Doe. It reminded viewers that these were real people with families and futures stolen, not mere cold case files.